Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to show you how to install Proxmox on your Asustor NAS. Now before we go any further, I've got a whole sea of disclaimers to get through, and again I'd like you to hear them, but if you skip forward I can't stop you. Number one, do bear in mind what you're going to do today is anti the position of the brand. What I mean by that is that if your system is still in any kind of support or warranty grace period with the brand, be it for your hardware supported warranty of 3 to 5 years or even that software support, if you do pursue this, there is every possibility that the brand will not be able to assist you if one, your system has any kind of difficulties and fails, or if you try to revert back to the Asustor ADM platform with your Asustor NAS moving forward and you hit a problem, because pretty much everything you do on a PC is recorded in one shape or form in the logs, be it back deep down in a BIOS or more. So bear that in mind. This is designed for those of you that have an old Asustor that is outside of your warranty period, or you've just put your hands in the air and gone, I don't care about support, I just want to get my hands on Proxmox. Which leads us to our second point. Proxmox, for those that aren't aware, is a virtual environment tool. It is a hypervisor for both virtual machines and containers, and it allows you to install virtual machines directly onto the bare metal, just with Proxmox in the middle. Now you might be wondering, why is that any different to just running the Asustor ADM platform with VirtualBox and deploying VMs there? And although it is incredibly similar, you've still got the resource consumption of ADM in the middle. And for a lot of users that have, be it for higher end business or even middle business that use things like VMware or Hyper-V, they know that they prefer to use a relatively light, efficient hypervisor tool on top of the bare metal, and then the VMs or containers on top of those. Why Proxmox? Well, Proxmox is open source, and although it does have a paid premium service attached if you want it, you can still access the gamut in terms of all of its features and services without paying. Some of which of those services, if you go to VMware, go towards Hyper-V, you have to pay a premium for things like high availability, such as scaling out clusters and stuff like that. And in other cases, with virtual machine tools for a lot of the NAS platforms and Windows and Mac systems, aren't even available because they are designed to run within an OS. So Proxmox gives you the features, and it's open source, but do bear in mind there is something of a learning curve. So those of you that have been using ADM on the Asustor, this is nowhere near as user friendly as that, so do bear that in mind. Last disclaimer, I know there's a sea of them, hopefully there's a time bar at the bottom. You're going to need several items in order to install Proxmox on an Asustor NAS. Let's go through them. Number one, you're going to need, where is it? A USB drive. You're going to need a USB drive of at least 16 to 32 gig. Now, the scale you go for is completely up to you. The reason being that if you're only going to use it to install Proxmox on the internal storage, you're only going to use it the once. But some of you may use it for repeated turns of introducing ISOs and system images to the existing virtual environment inside. But I would personally say this 32 gig, £7, 32 gig SanDisk UltraFit SSD hasn't let me down, and I've used it for pretty much everything on this channel, and I continue to recommend it. For 7 nicker, I'm cool with it. Next, you need something for the Proxmox installation to install onto, because although this system does have an internal flash storage drive that has ADM on it, you should not try to install it on that. More on that later. Yes, there is the main storage bays here, and those storage bays can be populated by hard drives or SSDs, but even then you're using a SATA based drive inside there, and whether it's hard drive or SSD, you kind of want to keep that storage for your virtual machines. Whether that is that you're going to run this system with maybe half TrueNAS and half OpenWRT or maybe pfSense all within the same system, or if you're going to be running dual OSs there to get, some play with some different ones, you want to save that area for your storage. That's why a lot of modern generation Asustor NASs also arrive with M2 NVMe upgrade slots, and those M2 slots can be used to install an NVMe inside, and then you can install the Proxmox hypervisor there on top. So I recommend, you don't have to do this because you can use the main base, but I do recommend grabbing yourself an M2 NVMe SSD if your system has available slots to install the Proxmox software onto there. Again, the capacity will be completely up to you. I'd recommend minimum 120 gig, but you can go ahead with even a small 60 gig if you choose. It's just a question of how many virtual machines are going to have their assets being read and written from that primary storage, not just connected to the additional bays there. Also, for virtual machines, again, optional extra, upgrade your memory. Make sure you've got at least 8 gig to 16 gig to play with. Yes, you don't need that much to run Proxmox on its own, but the minute you start adding VMs, you're going to be provisioning that storage out, so better to have it sooner rather than later. But again, an optional extra. Now, one of the things that isn't an optional extra, at least at the beginning, is creating a KVM, keyboard video mouse setup. Now the mouse, that's optional. You can use it, it's not hugely necessary, but you're going to need a keyboard, a USB keyboard at the beginning. And again, you only need it at the beginning or for troubleshooting. And you're also going to need an HDMI monitor to connect to the Asustor system. And again, that will become clear later on why when we're dealing with the BIOS. But either use an HDMI monitor in conjunction with that keyboard, or use a capture card like this one that allows you to attach the Asustor NAS to a PC HDMI to USB monitoring. That is what I'm going to use to show you guys the HDMI output of this during the course of this walkthrough. But again, you'll almost certainly need a monitor. You don't need it all the time, but you'll at least need it at the beginning. Finally, I will add, if you do have hard drives or a RAID array inside with all of your Asustor data all in a nice RAID ready to be used, if you install Proxmox on this, you're not going to be able to access the content of those drives. They are locked in to the Asustor ADM operating system. So just because the drives are in there doesn't mean you can run any old OS in Proxmox as a VM and access that data. Also, you run the risk of accidentally deleting it or reinitializing those drives. So if you're going to go down this road, make sure you remove your Asustor set of drives, and then later on, if you want to reverse this, then when you've reversed it, introduce those drives and you'll access that data once again. So that's everything we need. So the next step we're going to go for here is we're going to take our USB drive, we're going to connect it to my Windows machine, and I'm going to walk you through how to prepare this to install Proxmox. So let's flick over to the laptop now. So here we are on the screen. Forgive the angle that my face is at. We have quite a lot of stuff on the desk. Also, we're very close to the microphone, so I apologise if there's any feedback from the laptop fans or anything like that while I put that microphone there to the side. As you can see, the drive has appeared on my list of available drives here on screen. It's that one there called No Label. It's a 32 gig drive that's been formatted to FAT32. There's OBS there. So what we'll do is we'll head over to the web browser and I'll talk you through the tools you're going to need. So number one, you're going to need to download Proxmox. Download the latest version of Proxmox and make sure it's an ISO installer. Now, an ISO is a digital image of a, like an optical disc style, if you want, a standardized layer of data. However, there is no CD or DVD or Blu-ray drive on the Asustor NAS, so we will be needing a secondary tool to make that usable. But for now, download the latest stable version, and then you can download it there. Or if you want to not use it as a torrent, you can go ahead and just download normally as a point-to-point. I've already downloaded it, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel that there. Whether you're going to use a torrent or a standard version is totally up to you, but just make sure you download the whole file. It's about 1 gig. Next, you're going to need Rufus. Rufus is a USB bootable deployment tool. It effectively turns images like DVD, ISOs and more and converts them, rather than mountable images, into USB bootables there. It's a completely free application. You can either download the full installer application for your Windows system, or you can download just a quick double-click extractor file there that you can run portably. I recommend the portable version that you download there. Next, there's the USB that I'm going to be utilizing today. Should be linked below, but again, there are other capacities depending on what you're going to use. Same goes for an SSD. When it comes to performance versus price point there, I recommend this one, the Silicon Power 128 gig. I'll link to it below, largely because not only have I reviewed Silicon Power SSDs before, but this SSD, although it isn't tremendously fast, it's worth remembering that most Asustor NASs that have an M2 NVMe slot have been bottlenecked due to the arrangement of PCI lanes within the architecture of the system, at least until you get to the higher end system like Xeons and that. The result is that the slots inside a lot of Asustors are Gen 3 times 1, Gen 3 times 2, even Gen 2 times 2 or times 4. The result is, even if this SSD exceeded higher than these numbers, the system wouldn't allow it. So this gives you a great middle ground if you want to go for a micro drive there at 128 gig, and it's only 18 necker, and if you go up to 20 you can effectively double it. Last thing with the memory, just make sure you go for a memory that's compatible with your system. Again, DDR4, DDR3, and make sure you get the right length and format. So SODIMM's the small one, UDIMM and RDIMM are the longer ones, and that's really it. So now we'll head over to my download section here. And here is where we find that Rufus program I told you earlier on. Over here is the Proxmox image, and over here is the Rufus application. Double click that Rufus application. You may see a black screen there. Mute my laptop. And it will open up there on screen for us. As you can see, it's found that USB drive there, that no label drive. And it's what it next needs us to do is install on there that image. So what you do is make sure it says ISO image, and then from there click select, and then find in your download folder that Proxmox image installer. So as you see, we allow it to load up the files. I go one rank down, and there is Proxmox. Click open. Make sure, as you see, it's going to check that it's an ISO hybrid drive. Just click OK, you're fine. And then from that, get ready to click start. Now, before I do that, a quick diversion. If you did connect the USB drive to your local system and it didn't appear, or it has partitions and formats that you want to remove, type disk part here at the bottom left of the screen. Open it up there. Disk part will require authorization. From there, you go ahead and type the words list disk. Then select disk and give the number of the USB drive you're connecting, in this case disk 2, and then when you're ready, type the word clean and tap enter. Once you've done and tapped enter, it will remove any partitions that are on that disk, and it will make sure that any drive you're using with the likes of Rufus will go ahead and write directly onto that USB, and not any compressed areas caused by existing partitions. So from there, click start, and now it's going to erase all that data as mentioned, but on top of that, it's now going to create a USB bootable version of that Proxmox installer image. Now this can take a couple of minutes, and when that's done, we're going to safely disconnect it from my local PC here and head back over to the NAS on my right. So we'll let that finish up its thing. I would skip forward, but it's such a small amount of time. I think we can just skip forward a little bit there. Double check OBS is doing its thing. Why not? As you can see, it's refreshing the partition layout, and what you're going to see is a few windows popping up on screen. The reason it's doing that is now the bootloader there has created a bunch of new partitions on that USB for the Proxmox installation. So as you can see, it's created those two drives there. So the next thing you need to do, and although you can't see this on screen because my face is in the way, head to the bottom right and safely eject the USB drive. You should get a notification that it's done, and then remove the USB from your local machine. As I head back into OBS, and now I'm going to switch over to the USB capture there and head back over to the other camera. So from this point, what we need to do is take our USB drive and insert it inside the back of our Asustor NAS. Pop it inside there. Again, the placement of the USB. Make sure you use a USB Gen 3 slot as well, by the way, if you're using a Gen 3 drive. Make sure that your USB keyboard is connected. Make sure that your HDMI monitor is connected. Again, in my case, a capture card. Make sure you've installed your M2 NVMe if you plan to. I've already installed it. And if you're going to upgrade the memory, make sure you install your additional memory. I've already put in a 4 gig module. And that's it really. Now we're good to go. So what we need to do is we're going to head back over to this screen now. From here, I'm going to power up this Asustor system. Now, while it's doing that, I'm going to spam the F2 and escape keys on this keyboard, like so. Now, I know this is super irritating to hear me doing all of this right next to the microphone, but the reason I'm doing this is because different Asustor systems will use different modified or even complete variations of the same motherboard inside those NAS systems. The result is that the key that will take you through to BIOS can alter. Now, that can range from F2 to F12 and delete, but some of the older generation Asustor NAS that I've used to get into the BIOS settings have appeared using the escape key. So if you spam all four of them, there isn't any kind of negative option that you will encounter by doing those keys, and it will just save you time to go through them. Now, again, it will differ depending on the Asustor NAS you choose to use, as you can see there, but one of those keys will do the job depending on the device you use. But now we're seeing the graphical user interface of our Asustor NAS. What we need to do is head into the boot tab. Now, as you can see, the top option there is the eMMC card. That is an internal SSD there of around 4 to 5 gigabytes that houses the Asustor ADM program. And when the system is turned on, if there is drives inside or not, the first thing it will access regardless is that little flash storage. If the system doesn't have any existing data on the hard drives for ADM, the system then goes into the initialization. If there is data for ADM on those drives, it then goes into booting the Asustor program. What we want the system to do is boot from the USB. We want the first thing this system does is to access that USB drive, not the internal storage. In order to do that, highlight using up and down the USB drive and then click the plus symbol on your keyboard to maneuver the USB drive to boot priority number 1 above the eMMC card. That means when this system reboots, it will boot from the USB that we've just put in there and the Proxmox installation. Now, if later on you want to reverse what you've done today and switch back to ADM, all you need to do is highlight the eMMC card and move that up with the plus symbol. Simple as that. Any changes you make, such as, again, putting that back to USB, tap right on the D-pad and highlight Save Changes and click Confirm. That saves the settings to the CMOS battery, the memory on the system that's maintained by that CMOS battery, so it remembers all of these choices. For now, we can exit the system and now it will reboot, but this time boot directly from that USB. It will go through the initialization of the Asustor. So during first time setup and initial boot of these devices, what they do is they check that all of the individual internal system services are working, gradually ticking through each of them until eventually it will go into the boot sequence. That boot sequence is when it's going to access our newly attached USB drive there in order to boot up from the Proxmox installer. And from there we can install Proxmox on that M2 NVMe there. So let's leave it to do its thing for a bit. I could skip forward, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to get angry at seagulls for a while and allow the system just to finish what it's doing before it hops over to the Proxmox installer. Now, I mentioned earlier on with the Proxmox installer, you can use a keyboard and a mouse, but to be perfectly frank with you, you can manage all of this simply with the keyboard. So although there is the lower option, which allows you to install a debug mode version of Proxmox, or if you're having boot issues, you can repair the boot sequence or test your memory, what we want to do is head into the Install Proxmox VE option. From there, it will now load into the Proxmox installer, and from this point, we'll have to start creating our Proxmox boot disk from that M2 NVMe inside. As we make our way in, we can go ahead and start our options and setup there. So we'll move my USB camera there just into a new area. We'll move that to the left hand side of the screen while I try desperately not to completely break OBS. So from there, use the tab key to either scroll through the terms and conditions if you want to read them, or just use tab on the keyboard to get to I agree and confirm. From there, next, scroll down, and when you highlight the arrow next to target disk, tap down until you find the internal NVMe you've installed. Once you've selected that drive, go ahead and go the way down to the bottom onto next. From there, list your location, which in my case is the United Kingdom. Select it, go down, make sure you select your keyboard layer and your time zone there appropriately, and then click next. Then assign a password to the root account on this system and add your email address, as that will be needed for a lot of the remote hypervisor kind of services built into Proxmox. Then click next. So make sure with your host name to go for, if you're going to stick with something local, you can change this later on to pve.lan. And apart from that, go ahead and continue to the next stage and leave everything blank, or leave everything by default, as you can change these later on. And for now, we're just doing a local act test setup. And if you know what you're doing, perhaps you'd like to change some of those interfaces, but for now, I'd keep it default. Then you just need to review all of the choices that have happened thus far. You can go through them all, and then where it says automatic reboot after successful installation, highlight it and then tap enter. The reason being is you don't want the system to reboot with that USB drive still connected. Now, the amount of time this is going to take will differ depending on not only the complexity of the setup that you're going for, but also the storage drive that you install internally. Of course, if you use the M2 NVMe's, the write process is going to be significantly faster. But what I'm going to do is fast forward now to the completion of the Proxmox installation. And now things are drawing to a close. It should be done very, very shortly. And once it's done, we'll be able to power down our system, remove the USB, and just our last touch that we want to make sure we do just before the end of this, before we can completely finalize our installation. As you can see, there is our new IP ending 100.2. But before we do that, what we want to do is reboot this system. We want to remove that USB with the invitation there on screen to remove it. Now we just need to make our way into the web browser there. So when I change the order of my displays here, we can make our way into the web browser here that we were using earlier on. As you can see, the IP is ready to go. It's using an unsafe connection because I'm utilizing a local one there. I've not used any certificates or remote level encryption. Don't worry, you can take care of that yourself within Proxmox and within the network settings before you start opening holes to the wider world. Go ahead and log in with the credentials you created earlier on while setting the device up, and boom, just like that, you're now in Proxmox. Let's zoom in a bit there. Again, if you want to use some of the more kind of enterprisey support packages, you are going to have to go for a subscription with Proxmox.com, but pretty much the bulk of all of the apps and services within it, when that comes to supporting a myriad of different VM types, creating a VM here, going in and creating ourselves a little container side by side rather than utilizing individual applications to do so. Allowing individual storage within the system within Proxmox, whether you want to bolt on new storage areas within the hardware architecture of the system in the storage area with the individual SATA drives. If you choose, you can break down into that too. There's a whole host of different options open to you, along with things like high availability setting up straight off the bat and more. What I'm saying is with Proxmox, it is open source, but it is a lot to take in. So if you're going to make this step, know that you're not utilizing, you know, an easy, chewable, friendly program here. You are talking about quite an enterprise level product. It just happens to also be open source. Last thing, do remember, before you start creating any VMs or containers on this and doing everything you want to do, make sure you know that, one, that your drives that had your Asustor media on them can only be accessed from within an Asustor NAS and within that RAID group. And secondly, if you do want to reverse what you've done today to make sure you go back to utilizing ADM on your Asustor NAS, just make your way back into the boot manager and the BIOS that I showed you earlier on with utilizing that keyboard, and change the boot order back to the internal SSD there that's got ADM on board. But this has been how to install Proxmox on an Asustor NAS. I hope you found it helpful. There should be a guide link below in the description. Check that out. It might take an extra few days. We've got a lot of guides in the works right now. If you need support and help choosing the right network attached storage for you, then do use the free advice section link below and the free community support forum. And of course, if you have enjoyed this video, we'll be covering a lot more of these open source installations and going into a little bit more detail about Proxmox soon in other videos on the channel. So don't forget to click subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and of course like, just to help us know we're doing the right thing. But other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.